The film opens with a dramatic scene of stormy skies looming over a desolate island, complete with thunder. After that, the scene shifts to a teenage boy's bedroom, where George is focused on fixing a radio. He watches him, but only gets to catch a fleeting bit of frequency, despite his best attempts. After fiddling with the radio for a time, his buddies give up and leave because they're bored. Sorry for the small pause. It took a lot of hard work to find the movies, make the script, and edit them. Little request, please show your support. The boy goes to the local theater with his 3 buddies, where they watch a vintage black and white horror film while it is playing. George swiftly looks away when their eyes come into contact, as he grows fixated on the man with Down syndrome who is seated across from him. When the film concludes, George makes a move toward the man he's been staring at, attracting his friend's attention and causing some light-hearted teasing. When the boys visit a neighboring quarry the following day, they carefully and precisely find a snake hidden beneath a large stone. Amidst laughter and companionship, one of the boys, Luke, manages to knock out the snake with an electric shock and playfully throws it at George. George quickly sidesteps the surprise prank. When the young boys go home that evening, they resume their playful pranks. George becomes lost in his radio addiction and sits on his bed for hours at a time, fiddling with the little buttons in an attempt to get a signal. The following day, he joins up with his friend at the lake. As they look out at the far-off island, his friend Jacob talks of a monster that his sister says lives there. Jacob goes into detail about the enigmatic beast on the island, describing its enormous size and terrifying claws that could sever anything in its path. When asked about the creature's origins, he underlines that the horrific presence of the beast has effectively prevented anyone from visiting the island. When George wonders why their curious friend hasn't dealt with the monster, Jacob confesses that his sister's narrative merely said that the creature broke out from the underground and was responsible for the deaths of unfortunate persons. With a playful jab at George, Luke advises that they investigate the island themselves and take matters into their own hands. Luke says that George is just terrified. Urging George to act, Jacob and Luke stroll down the docking channel and jump aboard a waiting boat. After giving it some thinking, curiosity and a bit of bravado overcome any residual anxiety, and George chooses to go with them. The boys wonder if the mystery monster came in this way after seeing a broken down canoe as they approach the peaceful shores of the island. In a cunning move, they give George the electric zapping stick and encourage him to explore the area on his own. George gathers his bravery and takes the stick since he doesn't want to be the target of their jokes. George discovers pebbles attached to trees that are hanging eerily as he walks a few meters further onto the island. He's intrigued by what he sees and is about to investigate with his stick when he is startled back to reality by the loud noise of a boat engine. He returns hurriedly to the shore, only to find his pals there. He yells to greet the monster as he is about to leave. Feeling frustrated, he goes back to the beach and takes off his shoes, intending to let the sun dry them off while he strolls around the coastline. When George discovers the jumbled remains of a broken device, his creative imagination begins to see possibilities. He starts assembling the pieces, determined to create a way to communicate, and hopes to construct a makeshift radio out of the parts that can be saved. He's sitting there, tending to his wound and using his socks to construct a makeshift bandage to keep it from getting infected, when he hears scary noises coming from the woods. This startles him and causes him to get bitten by a snake. George embarks on a determined journey in search of assistance or any indication of civilization. He finds a tripwire stretched amid the trees that is causing the cans tied to it to ring as he searches the island. He explores around with the tripwire, disturbed and fascinated, but is shocked to see a huge claw mark embedded in one of the trees. Walking closer, he places his hand against the imprint, the contrast in size serving as a chilling reminder of the giant creature that might have left its mark. Moving forward, George stumbles upon a makeshift shack with a frightening display of fish heads impaled on its door. Startled by the sight, George quickly runs away, his heart pounding with fear. As he rushes away from the place, the sky darkens and rain begins to pour, seeking refuge from the heavy rain. George finds shelter within the hollowed bark of a fallen tree. As George awakens to the light of dawn, he is jolted by a searing pain in his hands. He removes his socks to discover his wound, overrun with ants and oozing pus, overcoming his shock. He slowly cleans the wound with his hands. Suddenly, the distant sounds of movement draw his attention, urging him to cautiously make his way back to the shack he had seen the night before. To his surprise, he finds a fire blazing in a barrel nearby. After ensuring the shack is empty, he resolves to take matters into his own hands, using his pocket knife to carefully cauterize the infected area of his hand. He is startled by another sound coming from the opposite direction of the woods. His heart races as he catches sight of a concealed figure, sending a surge of fear sing through him. George attempts to flee only to be stopped by a cunningly laid trap. After freeing himself, he lies flat on the ground, his senses heightened as he listens to the ominous footsteps passing by. After waiting for what seemed like an eternity, George cautiously rises and quickly retreats to the hollowed tree where he had slept the previous night. As he cowers within, his eyes widen in disbelief as he sees a looming figure that resembles a robot. Overwhelmed by fear and desperation, George grabs his infected arm and runs back to the shore, only to be greeted by the sight of the boat departing into the distance, frantically screaming for them to return. George falls into the water, unable to stand any longer. When he wakes up, George finds himself in a hospital bed, his arm amputated since the infection had spread too far to stop. His mother comes to pick him up and holds him in a tight embrace. After returning home, George becomes secluded, unwilling to meet up with his friends who would come to visit him one night while having dinner. George's father approaches him and asks if he has seen anything while he was out on the island. When George confirms that he has, his father reminds him that he should have never gone out there, but now that he has, he warns him never to tell anyone about what he had seen and makes him promise a couple of weeks later. George gets fitted for a cybernetic arm, which he can easily control returning to school. George begins to attend classes like he used to one day in class. A girl sitting next to him passes him a note asking if he is a robot, feeling embarrassed. George ignores the note and goes back to his studies that night. While lying in bed, he hears the frightening screeching he had heard on the island and sits up on his bed looking at the arm he had placed on the stand. For a few seconds, he tucks himself back into the sheets and goes to sleep. Years later, George awakens beside his wife Loretta and rises from bed to fix his robotic arm. Going to the kitchen, he prepares tea as Loretta joins him, commenting that he is talking in his sleep again. When he asks what he has been saying, she reveals that he seemed distressed about something. George sets his mug in the sink and notices that his robotic arm is malfunctioning. As he investigates the issue, he suddenly sees sparks coming from their room and quickly heads up the stairs. Upon reaching the source of the disturbance, he discovers his son Cole playing with the electric stick that George had once taken to the island, warning his son never to touch it again because it is dangerous. He hides the electric stick in the top part of his closet. Bothered by the constant glitches, George goes to get his robotic arm seen. While getting it fixed, the technician tells him that there are newer models he could use, but George refuses, feeling attached to the object he had had for years. After his appointment, George goes to the barbershop to get a haircut. While on his chair, a young child begins to touch his arm, curious about what it is smiling. George moves his hand around to show the little girl that there is nothing to be frightened of. Later that evening, as George stands at the sink brushing his teeth alongside his wife, he confides that he never told the full extent of what occurred during his time on the island to his friends, expressing his anxiety about revealing the truth. George admits his fear of speaking up. In response, Loretta reassures him that he doesn't need to make a fuss about it, mentioning that it was only a snake bite. As Loretta lies soundly beside him, George struggles to close his eyes. George gets out of bed and starts fiddling with his old radio, only to be shocked when it starts emitting the same shrieking sound he had heard on the island. The following day, George walks to the dock by the lake and looks curiously at the far-off island. After that, he goes to see his aged mother at the house where he was raised. He inquires as to whether his late father had ever shared anything about the island. George's mother tells him that the creature he had seen on the island had meant a great deal to his father, like a cherished kid regretfully admitting that society was not ready to accept it. She felt sympathy for the thing since it was a living thing. George confronts his mother after he becomes concerned about its survival and becomes irritated with her lack of empathy for his island experience. He demands to know why his father didn't just destroy the robot he had created with a sorrowful expression. George's mother opens up to him, telling him that his father was unable to kill the robot because it was his very first creation and had immense significance to him. George's father, knowing that society would find it impossible to accept something so strange, made the difficult decision to send the robot to the island and leave it there despite struggling with the guilt. The island, in his opinion, was the safest place for his remarkable creation. That evening, Intent on finding his father's masterpiece, George sets off toward the island in a boat. He finds the robot building a fire nearby and calls the path to the small shack. George jumps in as he sees the machine, which screams loudly as it approaches. George meets the robot, surprised, gathering his courage and telling it that his father was the one who gave it life. He also asks if it recognizes him. George apologized for hurting it the first time they met, tossing aside the electric stick in an act of kindness. He then went ahead and separated his own robotic arm, setting it down to represent his wish for peace and unity. With this action, he made it obvious that he wanted to rebuild friendships and establish a fresh relationship with the robot. I appreciate you watching, and I'll see you in the next video.